Okay, that's better. So, one of the problems that I run into all the time with this new computer that I've gotten is that it automatically tries to put me on its back camera. So, just for the record, everybody, anything made by Samsung is probably defective. Just a little. Anyway, I'm streaming on Saturday, and my wife is still asleep. So I usually use our back bedroom because I don't want to wake her up. I don't want her to think that I'm trying to wake her up. Anyway, we found out yesterday that the baby is a girl. So we're going to have a little girl, and her name is going to be Madeline, and it's going to be a traditional spelling of Madeline, not a bunch of Y's or unnecessary vestigial letters. So, name your kids real names. Anyway, our topic today is going to be about when Mercedes stopped making forever cars. And so what we're going to look at is the way that Mercedes built cars and constructed entire systems of operation through the through like the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And then we're going to look at how Mercedes changed the way that they built cars starting in the mid 1990s. And so some of you are not going to want to hear this because it's going to hurt your feelings, but that's okay. I don't care if anybody's feelings are hurt. So starting in the 1980s, let's say about 1985, Mercedes decided that they were going to, instead of engineering every little part as a separate part, certain parts were going to become integrated into an entire system. And this had already been exemplified on the W201, where if you look at a window regulator on the 201, you can't disassemble the 201 plastic window regulator into individual pieces like you could on a 123 series or a 126 series car. Nope. Everything was sort of cast or molded into one piece. Hence the ubiquitous 201 plastic window regulator. Now, these early plastic window regulators were not very good, but this was like a glimpse of the future. A part that wasn't made from other parts, but a part instead that was made from one giant piece of plastic. Now, this is a key principle going forward because Mercedes started to implement these ideas on the 124. So let's look at a 123 door panel versus a 124 door panel. The 123 door panel, what you have is you have a piece of cardboard, then you have some vinyl that's molded over it, and then you have these individual little plastic clips that you can remove from the 123 door panel if they break and put new ones on. On the 124 and the 126, to be fair, instead of putting plastic clips in the door panel that were replaceable, they decided to glue the plastic retainers onto the 124 door panel and the 201 door panel, or mold them into the door panel on the 126. So what happens if you break all the plastic clips, which is what happens a lot of the time when people try to remove these things, or they come unglued, which again happens a lot of the time. Well, they don't glue back on very easily. And on the 126, nothing can fix a broken plastic hook. If any of you have a solution for this, let me know. But you're in trouble. You are in a lot of trouble. So this is when you started to see some signs of cost cutting that were not only they were not only a sign of things to come, but they can be extremely frustrating to deal with if you have to deal with them in the present. So things started to get a little bit murky after that. We never ran into evaporator problems in 85 and earlier Mercedes. The 126s rarely had them, 85 and earlier. The 123s never had evaporator problems. But during the later part of the 80s, Gen 2 126 cars and 124 series cars and even some 201 series cars started to have evaporator issues. And of course, this continued with the W140. And based on what I understand, sometimes it happens with the W210 now and the W202 as well. But, you start hearing about a couple of issues that became really apparent with Mercedes that were not that easy to resolve. So the first one, of course, was the single row timing chain on the 380 SL. Next, we got into the evaporator failure crisis, where evaporators on 124 and 126 series cars, not as much on 126s, but definitely on 124, started to leak all the time. Then the problems began to extend into things like engine electrical harnesses in the early 90s, and 92 and 93, all the way up until 1996. Mercedes was trying to get their wiring harness formula correct, and they just could not seem to get the chemistry right until 96, 97, and then everything started to become a little bit more functional. And what ended up happening during this era was that you had Mercedes that had multiple serious issues. So these multiple serious issues included wiring harness issues, evaporator issues, issues with the reverse gear in the transmission, and I don't know, interior plastics issues in the 129. And of course, the difficulty of obtaining wiring diagrams for some cars. If I want a wiring diagram for a W140, I have to go on StarTech Info. Wiring diagrams for cars like the W140 and 202 C-Class are not easily obtainable. But things get even more interesting as you go on. People think 1996 was the end of the quality control issues, but it's really not. So enter the flexible service system. If you go underneath a Mercedes ML320, a 99 ML320, to do a transmission service, there is a drain plug on the torque converter. 2000 and later, no drain plug on the torque converter. Why would you not put a drain plug on your torque converter? Oh, wait, it's a sealed for life transmission, where life is about 150,000 miles. That means that if you want to extend your transmission's life, you have to perform a number of fluid services, every 5 or 10,000 miles, just to neutralize your fluid and get it clean again. But Mercedes was operating under the premise that the transmissions in these cars were able to go 150,000 miles to 200,000 miles without a fluid change. Now, this is the part that I find really perplexing, because if you look at these transmissions, they don't have a very good filter. The filter is just this little kidney bean shaped paper element that I think allows a lot of stuff to stay in the transmission, which is why graphite from the clutches gets on the conductor plates and shorts them out, and et cetera, et cetera. But these are some signs of the beginning of the end. I think that the other problems that we saw were the need for a computer to diagnose everything on the car. So this started to become really prominent with two models, the V8 124 series, like the 500E and the 400E, and of course the 140 series cars, which had that 32-pin connector under the hood. The 32-pin connector is the only way you're ever going to access any of the diagnostic codes on the car. There's no other way. So if you think that you can go out and buy like a 94 500 SL or an E500 or an E320 or some other Mercedes from the 90s, if you do not have the ability to tap into the diagnostic signal from that connector, you are never going to be able to diagnose that car. Anyway, we're going to look at the hallmarks of a not forever Mercedes now. So the first one is number one, you must have an electronic aid to diagnose the car. You must have a computer, an SDS system, a handheld tester, an OBD2 scanner, something. Now, I know that these things are the norm today, but I still continue to reject them because I think that the human brain is the best diagnostic tool. Hey, John. John Woods is on. By the way, thank you to all of you who congratulated me. I appreciate it. Now, number two, next hallmark of a non-forever Mercedes. You cannot take a component and break it up into individual components. So I can't take a window regulator or a power steering pump or even something as simple as a control unit and open it up or look at it or access the inside of it. It's sealed. It is made as one piece. If you can't glue it back together, you have to throw it away. And this became the norm later on going forward. So here's a good example. On the W202, you don't replace individual tie rods. You replace the entire steering linkage. On the W210, you don't remove and rebuild the steering rack. You replace it when it goes bad, and it's expensive and time consuming. That's just what you do on those cars. You throw away the entire assembly, the whole part. The whole part goes in the trash, and then you put in a new one that lasts for about 10 to 15 years. And in the meantime, you do it again. Okay, number four. Lack of serviceability. Remember the transmission torque converter drain plug that I mentioned? There's only one reason to not put a torque converter drain plug in. And it's because you don't want the torque converter to last. You don't want it to be serviceable. I don't see why anybody would want to put a torque converter drain plug in, other than the fact they're trying to save a few cents on manufacturing costs and maybe make some money later down the road. Number five, electronic components or electronically actuated components replace mechanically controlled ones. So instead of a mechanical throttle linkage, you have an electronic throttle linkage. Instead of a manual top, you have a power top. Instead of a bunch of solenoid valves controlling your vacuum routing for your climate control, you have one single circuit board that makes all of the decisions. Instead of your windshield wipers being activated by a switch, they go through a control unit that makes decisions about the wipers. Instead of your transmission being instead of your transmission gear selector being directly tied to the transmission, it goes through an electronic control unit that decides what gear you're going to go in until you spill coffee on it. Another one, instead of your brake pedal controlling what happens when you push the brakes, the brakes are governed by a control unit that decides how much brake pressure you need. Now, sure, the driver's giving the control unit feedback, but at the end of the day, if the control unit fails, your brakes aren't going to work properly. As documented with this, I can't remember what it was called. It was called selective braking system, SBS fiasco that Mercedes went through in the early 2000s. So let's look at some hallmarks of a forever car. First of all, on a forever car, every component is individually serviceable and replaceable. That means that on my 85 300 SD, if my center vents stop working, I can replace the center vent actuator and open it up and repair it and put a new vacuum diaphragm in. It means that I can change the solenoid valve that opens and closes when I select that center vent actuator, or it means that I can open up the case that the temperature regulator lives in, which is a simple solid state circuit board, troubleshoot it or send it out for rebuilding and reinstall it in the car without too much hassle. I don't have to get a VIN number encoder out. I don't have to make sure that I have exactly 12.75 volts or more to make the whole system work. Yes, there's some systems on modern Mercedes where if they don't have exactly 13 volts, nothing's going to happen. I think this is true with the transmissions especially. I heard about this on Nissans from my friend Jesse. I did some research. Mercedes has systems like this too. If you have a weak alternator, then your voltage falls, then certain parts of the transmission stop working. But another hallmark of a forever car is that you can trace a problem from its origin to its resolution without the use of an electronic scanner. So if I have a problem with my Zenith carburetor on a 250C, let's say the car won't idle. I was talking to my friend Mohammed about this yesterday. You don't get TCB Garage makes a good point. You get the headlight wet and the modules go bad. Uh-oh. I was talking to my friend Mohammed about the carburetor. He goes, car stalls and drive. Great. What do we know? We know that the car is supposed to have a function that assists it to keep running and drive. This function is performed by the vacuum regulator. The vacuum regulator is regulated by intake vacuum, and then you should adjust the vacuum regulator. He looked at his, and it has no screw in it that pushes down on the linkage. So guess what that means? It means his vacuum regulator isn't doing its job. So you put a 4 millimeter by 0.75 millimeter thread screw in, and it pushes the linkage down when you're in drive, and car runs good after that. Not a big deal, is it? But if you look at a similar car, like let's say you have a C230 that won't idle and drive, I don't even know where to begin. Look for a broken vacuum line. That's the response you're going to get on a web forum. The problem that I see a lot of the time with newer Mercedes is that there's no clear-cut explanation as to what fails or why certain things fail. The Sprinter van is a good example. They have an EGR valve that has to send a voltage feedback signal to the ECU to keep the thing running. And the first time that I learned about this, I found out that if the EGR valve goes bad, when the car is hot, it won't start. What the heck? It's a diesel. It's a 5-cylinder diesel. There's no reason that anything should interrupt that vehicle from starting, let alone a stupid EGR valve that has no bearing on whether the engine even runs or not. I mean, if you have an EGR valve that is broken, I mean, sure, you might have some running problems, but it shouldn't keep the car from starting. And if you think about it, people use Sprinter vans for work. These are work vans. If you have to go from one job to another, or you're doing deliveries and you get in your Sprinter van and it doesn't start for the next 20 or 30 minutes due to a bad EGR, you're just losing money. So you go to Wahler and get another EGR. And guess what happens 30 or 40,000 miles later? It goes bad. Ridiculous. We shouldn't have to put up with this stuff. This is why I tell people, if you want a good car, go buy a 40-year-old, 30-year-old, etc. Mercedes and restore it. Go do it. If you want a forever car, that's how you get a forever car. Yes, there's a lot of hard work involved. And what I see a lot of the time is that we have these situations where people call us and they go, I want a forever car. I want a car that's going to last me forever. I want a car that I'm not going to have to deal with a VIN encoder or a stupid scanner, and I don't need diagnostic software for. It's like, well, Mercedes built cars like that up till approximately 1991 or 92, where you can get by diagnosing stuff with a voltmeter. If you cannot use a multimeter, volt, ohm, millivolt, milliamp to diagnose a car, okay, I'm just telling you, if you can't easily use, I'm not talking about sit there and wait for a voltage pulse and another pulse and another pulse and then try to count them while you're checking for a trouble code. I'm talking about if you cannot sit there and do a resistance check on a part, do a voltage test on a part, look for a voltage value. If you can't do that on a car, it is not a forever car, because what you're relying on is a computer to do the diagnosis for you. And there's that problem. This is a problem. So this is why I keep telling people on this channel, don't LS swap your 85 190E. Don't think that don't put a 351 Windsor in your 82 240D because it's quote unquote slow. Pretty soon in the future, people are going to be crying, screaming and crying and begging for analog cars. They are going to be wishing so badly that they had analog cars that you'll see the price of crappy, even like rusty, color changed, ugly 123 selling for $5, $6, $7,000. I'm starting to see scenarios like this where cars that should not sell for $2, $3, $4,000 are selling for $5, $6, $7, $8, $9, $10,000. I have had so many problems with customer cars, that I didn't even think they should be buying, but I'm still happier to deal with a rusty 123 with a bunch of issues because everything is analog. That's really the truth. So why is it that I keep iterating this line? The last really good Mercedes model platforms were all introduced before 1990. Why do I keep saying that over and over again? Well, because Mercedes was not trying to obfuscate everything with electronic controls. So let's see here. So what do I think the last good Mercedes is? I get this question a lot. The last good Mercedes was probably the 95 E300. The last really good Mercedes that I don't every day. I'm not talking about a gas car. It's a diesel, E300 diesel. That's it. In 96, when they switched that body style to the 210, they ruined the E300 because they made it necessary for the engine control unit to work, to operate, in order to keep the car running. If you have a problem with the ECU or the crank position sensor or whatever, engine doesn't run anymore, just shuts off, goes into limp mode. Limp mode is Satan. It's the worst possible thing that can happen. It's like, why would a car even go into limp mode? It either runs or it doesn't, I don't know. It's stupid. I guess limp mode is so that the car can limp to the dealership so they can charge you $5,000 or $6,000 to diagnose and repair a sensor, and keep changing that sensor every 50,000 miles or so. The other, as far as gas Mercedes goes, the last really decent gas Mercedes that I'd say is an extremely serviceable car is the 93 W201. Now, I've complained about the 201 numerous times. I mean, I've complained about them all the time, but at the end of the day, in order to diagnose the engine and the transmission and rear axle, and even to an extent the climate control, you don't need anything but a multimeter and a working brain. And that means that you are able to keep one of these cars going without too much pain and suffering. The 1993 and later gasoline 124 that went to HFM SFI injection does not get lumped into this group of really great Mercedes. In fact, if you have a 94, 95 E320, it is basically a BMW. Yes, it's as gimmicky as a BMW. because wiring harness. What do you do? What's the trilogy, not trilogy, the quintology of failures on a late 124 chassis? Engine wiring harnesses, evaporator, reverse clutches, head gasket, throttle actuator. So these are 5 items that all cost thousands of dollars to fix. Throttle actuator is the cheapest, but it will give you the most headaches with diagnosis. Evaporator is the most expensive, followed a close second by everything else with thousands of dollars, $3,000 in labor, sometimes $4,000 in labor cost if you have other items that need to be dealt with on the AC system. But 5 major areas. There was never a Mercedes that had 5 major weak points until they came out with the 93 300E/E320. How do I know? Because I owned one and it was a great car. But at 52,000 miles, I had to change a head gasket and a lower wiring harness. The upper harness and throttle actuator had already been replaced at 52,000 miles. And the evaporator. Basically a BMW. Basically. Nothing special, nothing sets it apart. I look at the 94, 95 E320, I say, this car is no better than a BMW. It's full of gimmicks, it's full of electronic issues, it's full of problems that will make the car essentially worthless if it breaks. It's full of struggles, labor struggles where you have to struggle to get the car fixed when it's broken. When you get one of those cars, you basically start spending money, and when you're done, $15,000 later, you have a good car. But they're basically a BMW. There's nothing analog about the car. So, on the other hand, what constitutes a really good analog car? An analog fuel injection system, whether it's mechanical or a primitive electronic system like D-Jet. What else? An analog transmission, no control unit needed. I mean, transmissions are complicated. There's no way around saying an automatic transmission isn't complicated, but it's a lot less complicated when you don't have a stupid control unit confusing you all the time. Electronic control units and transmissions either create problems or they mask internal problems in the transmission. People ask about the 129 chassis a lot. Well, the 129, unfortunately, some people seem to think it's a forever car. If you can get forever out of an R129, I congratulate you. But Mercedes did not design the 129 to be a forever car, especially after 1993 when they dumped the KE Jetronic injection system. If you don't mind driving around without climate control and with a broken power top, the 129 is a forever car. If you expect everything in the car to work, then you're in a lot of trouble. You really are. I'm not trying to be mean or piss anybody off, but the truth is those of us that have analog Mercedes, when we start looking at these cars that require an electronic diagnostic aid like SDS, Star Diagnostic System, or we start seeing a car that has an unresolvable electrical issue with a security system. Security systems are the worst. The W202 was the first car to have a security system that was so fully integrated in the car that it would absolutely paralyze the car if it failed. What are you going to do about that? Nothing. But we with older, more analog cars start seeing this sort of problem. And we're like, this is a gimmick. This is ridiculous. There's no reason that we should have to put up with that. I will take my older, slower, more analog cars so that I don't have to deal with the diagnostic headache. Just because, your newer car takes 3 less seconds to get to 60 miles an hour or even 10 less seconds. I don't care. I don't mind. I don't mind driving a car that takes 13 seconds to get to 60 miles an hour because I'm not going to have to sit there with an SDS machine trying to get it to accept a new seat control module or a new engine cooling fan module or a new throttle actuator. If you have an E500 or 500E, if you change your throttle actuator, You have to go in with SDS and do what I call back flushing, kill and erase all of the old codes that the bad throttle actuator caused. If you don't do that, car will never run right, ever. They won't clear them themselves either. You know. Anyway, if it was introduced after 1990 or later, bad. If it was introduced before 1990, good. So yeah. Anyway, I'm going to take a few questions now. So Marcin Hunevitz says your prediction part supply will dry up eventually. When? I'm really not sure if it ever will, because Mercedes is making a killing off of classic parts, but they're not doing a great job with the 201, 124, 123, and 126. I think what it's going to take, Marcin and my other listeners, to get part supply back up is a really young, dynamic group of guys who appreciate the young timers who are working for Daimler-Benz. So I'd say that if you're like a viewer of mine and you like classic Mercedes and you're young and you're in Europe or you want to work in corporate America, I would say ride the wave and go work for Mercedes so that you can get on the inside so you can make sure that we have parts. Julian Hickman thank you. I was scared of the complexity of the R129. He asked about an 89 500 SL. Well, an 89 500 SL is an R107 in the United States to us because they made them for they kept making the 107 into 89. And I guess in 89 they came out with the R129 as well. Julian, if you're talking about a 129, you should be somewhat scared of it, but thankfully the 89, 90, 91, 92 still has KE Jetronics, so it will still run, but I wouldn't say it's a necessarily great car. All right. TCB Garage. My 380 SEL slips into third and fourth. My mechanic wants to rebuild. I'm not so sure. I don't know how many miles are on the 380 SEL, but it sounds to me like your clutches and your 3/4 clutch pack are worn, so you may have to rebuild. The other problem is that you may need to replace the clutch pack housing seal, which is riveted in. But you can adjust the vacuum modulator in a little bit and see if raising the modulating pressure gets rid of the 3/4 slip. Okay, Hito, what do you think of the 300 SD W140? Great engine, wonderful engine, awful chassis. That's what I think. Sorry if you're offended by this 140 fans. I am a mean person with a heart of stone. I don't care what you think. Yeah, I think it's funny. Who needs John Woods, my friend who's on this live stream, JT Woods 41978. He says, who needs 60 miles an hour faster? Who needs to get to 60 miles an hour faster than in 15 seconds? John does pro touring in a Firebird, if I remember right, a pro touring built Firebird. So this is like a race car driver. This guy's a race car driver. All right. Rodolfo, what about the CLKW 208? Sorry, not a forever car. Wow. So Kev Dupuis found a fix for the 124 and 126 door panel hooks. That's great that you guys figured it out. John, if you could post that video in this feed, that would be good. Somebody asked, what do you think of the 140 S600? Again, it's not a forever car. All right, Janos, what's your opinion of it's the M123 250 engine, but yeah, the 250 used an engine called the M123. This engine had a mixed reputation. Some people thought it was a terrible engine. Some people thought it was a good engine. My understanding is that it still got 5 main bearings, which makes it an iteration of the old M180 engine. That's what the M123 is. It is a modernized version of the M180 engine. So if you take care of these engines, they are rebuildable. And yeah, they're real screamers at high RPMs when you're driving down the highway. They at 60 miles an hour, you're turning almost 3,500 RPM, but they're simple enough. I mean, you can keep one going without having to resort to a bunch of ridiculous things like replacing a cylinder head, every 50 or 60,000 miles or something. John, I thought about this. This is why I want Mercedes Club to actually work because we're supposed to be the petition. All right, TCB Garage. I have a spare auto off of a good 420 SEL. Yes, it'll work in your 380. Thank you, Marchin, for wanting to bring me your car. I'll be ready for you whenever you are. All right, this is a good question. What are your thoughts on the 91 300E? So, all things aside, the driveline in the 91 300E isn't a bad one. I mean, you might have to do a head gasket and valve guide rebuild, but there are some items in this car, like especially things like interior door panels and interior parts and the evaporators, which go bad on the 91s, but not nearly as bad as the later 124s. You're still going to have some issues with this car, but overall, it's still a pretty analog car. In other words, you can still keep it running with, some with the voltmeter. Thank you so much for all my Patreon supporters. Anyway, guys, I'm going to go enjoy my Saturday. Thank you all for watching. I like to do these live streams early because it means that I can get some stuff done throughout the day. But I look forward to seeing you all again on the next live stream. And LM, just so you know, yes, we discussed the 85 300 SD. It is a forever car. Absolutely. All the early 126 cars are still forever cars. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please hit that like button. And, be sure to subscribe if you haven't. Shazzy asked me, where does one go to get some hands-on training on Mercedes classics? You have to find somebody who's been doing it for years and become their apprentice. That's how you get the training. That's how. Anyway, thank you guys. I'll see you next time. I appreciate all of you. Keep your classic Mercedes on the road. Sayonara.